It wasn't supposed to happen like this. No whispers, no gradual transition, no royal consensus, just a sudden, decisive move that rippled through the palace like a shockwave. Prince Edward, long considered one of the monarchy's most quietly loyal figures, made a choice that stunned insiders and blindsided one key figure entirely. And as the news broke, one question echoed louder than the rest. How could something this monumental happen without Camilla even knowing? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The announcement didn't creep into the public domain, it arrived with force, cutting through the carefully controlled rhythm of royal communication. There had been no hints, no carefully planted previews in the press, no coordinated effort to prepare the institution or the public. It was abrupt, almost surgical in its execution, as if Prince Edward had chosen precision over diplomacy. And that alone raised eyebrows, because within the monarchy, nothing of consequence happens without layers of consultation. Nothing moves without alignment. Yet this did, quietly planned, but explosively revealed. It carried a tone that felt deliberate, formal, restrained, and yet unmistakably distant, as though every word had been chosen, not just to inform, but to signal something deeper. Royal charities to the outside world might appear as extensions of goodwill, noble efforts tied to compassion and service. But inside the palace, they hold a different kind of power. They shape influence, they determine visibility, they build networks that stretch far beyond ceremonial appearances. For years, Prince Edward had been the steady force behind these organizations, nurturing them, expanding them, embedding his identity into their purpose. And then, in a single move, he let them go. Not gradually, not symbolically, completely, handed over to Lady Louise, young, composed, and until now, positioned far from the center of royal power. The reaction inside palace corridors was immediate, though carefully contained. Conversations slowed, voices dropped. Behind closed doors, confusion gave way to disbelief, and disbelief to something far more unsettling: silent panic. Because this wasn't just unexpected, it was disruptive. It broke an unspoken rule, and in doing so, it exposed something fragile beneath the monarchy's polished exterior. The sense that control, once absolute, was now shifting in unpredictable ways. And perhaps most striking of all was not just what had happened, but who had been left out. Camilla's absence from the process was impossible to ignore. Not mentioned, not acknowledged, not even subtly included. In a structure where her presence is typically woven into every significant decision, this omission felt sharp, almost intentional. It raised questions no one dared to ask openly. Had she been deliberately excluded, or had something fractured so deeply within the inner circle that communication itself had broken down? Because this wasn't a minor oversight, it was a silence that echoed louder than any statement. And then there was the tone of the announcement itself. Controlled, measured, almost cold. It lacked warmth, lacked the collaborative language that usually defines royal transitions. There was no sense of shared vision, no nod to unity. Instead, it carried the weight of finality. As if Edward wasn't just transferring responsibility, he was drawing a line, quietly but unmistakably, a line that separated the past from whatever was coming next. At first glance, it could be dismissed as a simple decision, an aging royal passing duties to the next generation. But the deeper one looked, the more it began to feel like something else entirely, a message, shift, perhaps even a warning. Because in an institution built on tradition, moves like this don't happen without reason. And when they do, they rarely mean only one thing. But behind this sudden announcement lay years of quiet tension. Tension that had been building long before Edward made his move. She was never meant to stand at the center of royal power. For years, Lady Louise moved quietly through the monarchy, graceful, composed, and largely unnoticed by the public eye. But behind that calm exterior was a growing presence, one that Prince Edward had been carefully nurturing. And now, in a single sweeping decision, she was no longer in the shadows. She had become something far more powerful and far more dangerous. For most of her life, Lady Louise existed just outside the glare that defines royal existence. While others were shaped by relentless attention, she was allowed something rare: space to observe, to understand, to grow without the pressure of constant scrutiny. But that distance was never accidental. It was intentional, carefully protected, because while the world saw a quiet young royal, Prince Edward saw something else entirely potential that didn't need noise to be powerful. He didn't rush her into the spotlight. He guided her toward it, slowly, deliberately, almost invisibly. Their bond was never performative. It wasn't built for cameras or public approval. It was grounded in something deeper: trust, patience, and a shared understanding of what the monarchy truly demanded behind its polished image. Edward didn't just raise Louise, he prepared her. Not through grand gestures, but through subtle exposure. Conversations that carried weight, moments that tested judgment, quiet introductions to the inner workings of influence that most would never even notice. And over time, those moments began to shape her into something far more capable than anyone outside their circle realized. There were signs, though, small, almost imperceptible shifts that in hindsight feel impossible to ignore. Louise began appearing where decisions were being shaped, not announced. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her words carried clarity beyond her years. Palace staff noticed it first, the way she carried herself, the way she absorbed complexity without hesitation. There was no arrogance, no need to assert authority, yet authority seemed to follow her anyway. Quietly, naturally, as if it had always been there, waiting to surface. And that's what made this moment so unsettling. Because the image the public held of Louise, gentle, reserved, almost peripheral, didn't align with the role she had just been given. The scale of it was immense. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or a ceremonial nod to the next generation. This was power. Real, structural, deeply embedded power. The kind that shapes narratives, builds alliances, and defines legacy. And suddenly it belonged to her. But perhaps the most revealing part of all wasn't Louise herself, it was Edward's decision to choose her. Not a more senior royal, not someone already entrenched in the hierarchy, Louise. That choice alone spoke volumes. It suggested foresight, strategy, a belief that the future of influence within the monarchy didn't lie where everyone assumed it did. It lay somewhere quieter, more controlled, more intentional, and perhaps more resilient. Because Edward understood something others may have overlooked. Influence isn't always loud. It doesn't always demand attention. Sometimes it grows in silence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. It simply takes its place. Now Louise stands at the center of something far larger than herself, not just as a figure of responsibility, but as a symbol of a shift that few saw coming. And as that realization begins to settle, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a transfer of duties. It was the emergence of a new kind of power. One that had been building quietly, patiently, and now, undeniably. Yet this wasn't just about elevating Louise, it was about redefining control. And that's where the real tension begins to surface. To the public, royal charities appear as symbols of goodwill causes championed with compassion and dignity. But inside palace walls, they represent something far more complex: influence, visibility, legacy, control. And when Prince Edward chose to transfer these charities, he wasn't just handing over responsibilities, he was shifting a delicate balance of power that had been carefully maintained for years. Because in the monarchy, perception is everything, and royal charities are one of the most powerful tools used to shape that perception. They are not just about helping causes, they are about defining identity. Each initiative becomes an extension of the royal attached to it, a living reflection of their priorities, their values, their reach. Over time, these associations build something far greater than public goodwill. They create influence that extends beyond ceremonies and speeches into real networks of power that operate quietly but effectively. Prince Edward understood this better than most. For years, he had cultivated these charities with a steady hand, avoiding unnecessary attention while strengthening their foundations. His approach was not loud or attention-seeking, but it was deliberate. Every partnership, every appearance, every decision added another layer to a network that was both respected and deeply embedded. These organizations didn't just support causes. They connected him to influential figures, global platforms, and narratives that shaped how the monarchy was seen in a changing double world. And that is why this transfer feels so significant, because relinquishing control of these charities is not a simple act of delegation, it is the surrender of a carefully built sphere of influence. The financial backing tied to these institutions, the social connections they sustain, the symbolic authority they carry, none of it disappears. It moves, and now it moves to Lady Louise, not gradually, not partially, completely, which raises an unsettling realization. Louise hasn't just inherited responsibility, she has stepped directly into a position of quiet but undeniable power. What makes this even more striking is how rare such a move truly is. Within the royal structure, influence is rarely handed over in such a decisive way, especially to someone who has, until now, remained largely outside the central hierarchy. Power is usually redistributed slowly, carefully, almost invisibly. But this was different. It was immediate, intentional, almost disruptive in its clarity. And that suggests something deeper at play, because decisions like this are not made lightly, and they are certainly not made without consequence. There is also a symbolic weight to consider. By transferring these charities, Edward is not just stepping back, he is redefining who holds relevance within the monarchy. He is shifting attention, redirecting influence, and in doing so, subtly reshaping the internal balance that governs royal dynamics. It sends a message, whether spoken or not, that the future may not belong to those who currently hold visible authority, but to those who are being positioned behind the scenes. And perhaps that is where the real tension lies, because power, once moved, does not simply settle, it creates ripples. It challenges existing structures. It forces questions that cannot easily be ignored, especially when those who were expected to be part of such decisions find themselves standing outside of them. And if this shift was about power, then one question becomes unavoidable. Why was Camilla left out entirely? In royal tradition, nothing of significance happens without consultation, especially when it involves power, legacy, and public image. But this time, something was different. Camilla, a central figure in the monarchy's current structure, was not just sidelined, she was completely excluded. No warning, no involvement, no acknowledgement. And as the realization set in, it became clear that this wasn't an oversight. It was intentional, because within the monarchy, consultation is not courtesy, it is control. It is the mechanism that ensures unity, or at least the appearance of it. Every decision, particularly one involving influence as significant as royal charities, is expected to pass through a careful web of discussions, approvals, and silent agreements. And Camilla, positioned firmly within that structure, was never someone who would simply be informed after the fact. She was expected to be part of the process, to shape it, to guide it. That had been the unspoken rule until now. The shock wasn't just about her absence, it was about what that absence implied. Inside palace corridors, reactions were measured, but the tension was undeniable, because if someone of Camilla's standing could be excluded so completely, then the rules themselves were no longer stable. Conversations that once flowed through established channels had clearly shifted. Something had changed long before the announcement was made, something subtle but significant enough to disrupt the very system that held everything together. There had been signs, though they were easy to dismiss at the time, moments where communication felt strained, decisions that seemed to move forward without the usual coordination, a growing sense that certain voices were being heard less, while others, quieter, less expected, were gaining ground. These weren't loud confrontations or public disagreements. They were quieter than that, controlled, contained, but persistent, and over time they began to form a pattern. For Camilla, the realization would not have come all at once, but in fragments, a shift in tone here, a delayed update there, the subtle awareness that something was unfolding just beyond her reach. And then, suddenly, the full weight of it, the announcement, public, final, unchangeable. It wasn't just a decision, it was a moment of exposure. A moment where control, once assumed, revealed itself to be far less certain than it appeared. Outwardly, composure remained intact. That is the expectation. The monarchy does not fracture in public. It does not display uncertainty or conflict. But behind that controlled exterior, the emotional impact would have been impossible to ignore. Because this wasn't just about being left out, it was about what that exclusion represented. A challenge, a shift, perhaps even a quiet removal of influence that had once been unquestioned. And within the palace, that perception began to take hold. This wasn't seen as a simple oversight or a breakdown in communication. It felt deliberate, calculated, a move that carried intent beneath its surface. Because excluding someone like Camilla doesn't happen by accident. It requires choice. It requires confidence. And most of all, it requires a willingness to accept the consequences that follow, which raises a deeper, more unsettling question. What had changed so fundamentally that Prince Edward was willing to take that risk? Because this decision didn't just alter responsibilities, it disrupted relationships. It challenged hierarchy. It signaled that the balance of influence within the monarchy was no longer where it once was. And once that balance begins to shift, it rarely peas with a single decision. But to understand why Edward would take such a risk, we have to look deeper into the fractures that had been quietly widening behind closed doors. The monarchy thrives on unity, or at least the illusion of it. But behind the polished appearances and carefully managed narratives, tensions had been brewing. Conversations that turned cold, decisions that sparked quiet resistance, and alliances that began to shift in unexpected ways. By the time Edward made his move, the cracks were no longer subtle, they were deep, and they were impossible to ignore, because long before the announcement shocked the public, something quieter had been unfolding behind closed doors. A slow but undeniable divergence in vision, not loud enough to erupt into open conflict, but strong enough to create distance. Edward had always been seen as steady, aligned with the institution's core values, but over time that alignment began to evolve. Where others clung tightly to tradition, Edward seemed to lean towards something more adaptive, more controlled, less dependent on rigid hierarchy. And that difference, subtle at first, began to create friction. It wasn't about one disagreement or a single decision. It was cumulative, a series of moments where perspectives didn't quite match, where priorities quietly clashed. The question of how the monarchy should evolve, whether to preserve its established structure or reshape it for a changing world, became an undercurrent that influenced everything. Some believed in maintaining clear lines of authority, keeping influence concentrated and predictable. Others, like Edward, appeared to question whether that model could truly endure, and in that difference, tension took root. Over time, those tensions began to reshape relationships. Conversations grew more measured, less open. There was a sense that not everything was being shared anymore, that certain decisions were being made in smaller circles, or perhaps even alone. Edward, once known for his consistency, began to show signs of quiet independence. Not rebellion, not defiance, but a willingness to act without waiting for consensus. And in an institution where unity is everything, even that small shift carried weight. Loyalty, too, began to take on new meaning. It was no longer just about allegiance to the crown, but about alignment with a vision. And as that vision began to fragment, so did the sense of cohesion within the inner circle. Some remained firmly tied to tradition, reinforcing the existing structure. Others seemed more open to change, though rarely openly. The result was not open division, but something far more complex, an environment where trust became selective and influence began to move in less predictable ways. And through it all, Edward watched, not loudly, not impulsively, but carefully, as if he understood that the moment would come when observation would no longer be enough, that eventually a decision would have to be made, not just about roles or responsibilities, but about direction, about what the monarchy should become, and who should carry that vision forward, which makes his eventual move feel less sudden and more inevitable, because by the time he acted, the groundwork had already been laid, the fractures had already formed, the sense of misalignment had already reached a point where maintaining the status quo no longer felt sustainable. What appeared to the outside world as a shocking decision was, in reality, the culmination of something much deeper, something that had been building quietly, patiently, beneath the surface. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. Not just the act itself, but the realization that it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from pressure, from difference, from a growing belief that change was not only possible, but necessary. And as those fractures widened, Edward's decision began to look less like a surprise, and more like a statement. Was this an act of loyalty or a quiet rebellion? Prince Edward had always been seen as steady, dependable, and deeply committed to the institution. But this decision challenged everything people thought they knew about him. It wasn't just bold, it was deeply personal. And as analysts began to dissect his motives, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about the present, it was about the future he wanted to shape. For decades, Edward had built a reputation that was almost unshakable. He was the royal who didn't disrupt, the one who followed the rhythm of duty without seeking the spotlight. Reliable, consistent, predictable, and that predictability became part of his identity. It allowed others to assume they understood him completely. But perhaps that was the greatest misconception of all, because beneath that calm exterior, there may have been something far more deliberate at work, something that didn't need to announce itself until the right moment arrived. This decision, as sudden as it appeared, carries the weight of long-term intent. It doesn't feel impulsive, it feels prepared, as though Edward had been quietly positioning himself and Louise for this exact outcome. Every step, every subtle shift in responsibility, every moment where Louise was allowed to observe, to engage, to learn, it all begins to form a pattern. Not random, not accidental, a slow construction of something that would eventually demand to be recognized. And then there is the question of protection. Because handing over such significant influence to Louise is not just an act of trust, it is an act of positioning. It places her within a structure that offers both visibility and control, but also shields her in a unique way. Instead of being thrust into the unpredictable chaos of public royal life, she is anchored within something more stable, more defined. Was this Edward's way of safeguarding her future, of ensuring that she would not have to fight for influence later, because it had already been secured for her? But protection alone doesn't explain the boldness of the move. There is something more here, something that edges closer to defiance, because choosing to act without consensus, to bypass established expectations, is not just a logistical decision, it is a statement, a declaration that at least in this moment, Edward was willing to prioritize his own judgment over the collective structure that had always defined royal decision-making. And that shift, however controlled, carries consequences. Legacy also looms heavily over this decision, not the kind measured in titles or ceremonies, but something deeper, influence that lasts, impact that reshapes how the monarchy functions, even if only in subtle ways. Edward's choice suggests a desire to leave behind more than a record of service. It suggests he wanted to redefine something, to alter the path, even slightly, so that what comes next is not simply a continuation of what has always been. And that raises a question that lingers beneath everything. Was this a calculated strategy or a personal stand that could no longer be delayed? Perhaps it was both, because within institutions like the monarchy, personal conviction and strategic thinking are rarely separate. They intertwine, shaping decisions that appear controlled on the surface, but carry emotional weight beneath. What is certain is that Edward crossed a line that few expected him to approach. He stepped beyond quiet loyalty into something far more complex, not openly rebellious, but undeniably independent. And in doing so, he didn't just change his own position, he forced the entire structure around him to respond. Because when someone known for stability chooses disruption, it doesn't go unnoticed. It reshapes expectations, it challenges assumptions, it creates uncertainty in a system built on control. But Edward's move didn't just redefine his own role, it sent shockwaves through the entire royal structure. The moment the announcement became public, the palace was thrown into a state of controlled chaos. Statements were drafted, conversations intensified, and behind closed doors, reactions ranged from disbelief to quiet outrage. This wasn't just another royal update, it was a disruption. And as the dust began to settle, the monarchy faced a question it could no longer avoid: what happens when the rules are rewritten from within? At first, the response followed a familiar pattern: composure on the surface, carefully chosen words, measured tones that suggested stability, even as uncertainty pulsed beneath. Senior royals appeared aligned, at least publicly, reinforcing the idea that everything remained under control. But behind that controlled exterior, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Conversations were sharper, more urgent. Questions that would normally be addressed quietly now carried a sense of weight, as though each answer might reveal something far more significant than intended. Because this wasn't just about one decision, it was about precedent. And precedent, within the monarchy, is everything. The idea that a senior royal could independently transfer such influence without consultation sent a ripple of concern through the entire structure. If this could happen once, what prevented it from happening again? That question lingered, unspoken but deeply felt. It challenged the assumption that authority moved in predictable ways. It introduced uncertainty into a system that depends on control. Efforts to maintain a unified narrative intensified almost immediately. Messaging became precise, carefully aligned to avoid any hint of division. But the more controlled the narrative appeared, the more it hinted at something beneath the surface. Because unity, when forced, often carries a different kind of tension. It suggests that agreement is being managed, not naturally shared. And in this case, that distinction mattered. At the same time, subtle shifts began to take place, quiet, almost imperceptible realignments of influence. Relationships that once felt stable started to evolve. Some figures moved closer to Edward's perspective, whether out of agreement or necessity. Others seemed to retreat, holding firmly to established structures that now felt slightly less certain. It wasn't a dramatic reshuffling. It didn't need to be. Even the smallest adjustments carried significance because they reflected a deeper recalibration of where influence now resided. Outside the palace, curiosity surged. The public, long accustomed to carefully managed royal narratives, sensed that something different had occurred. Not just a change in responsibility, but a shift in tone, a break from expectation. And that curiosity only amplified the pressure within, because perception and reality are tightly linked in the monarchy. What the public believes shapes what the institution must become. And as that awareness grew, so did the unease. Because beneath the surface, a realization was beginning to take hold. This moment could not simply be contained or explained away. It had already altered something fundamental. The balance had shifted, the boundaries had blurred. And once that happens, returning to the old structure becomes far more difficult than maintaining the illusion of stability. What makes it even more unsettling is how quietly it all unfolded. There was no confrontation, no dramatic rupture, just a decision, executed with precision, that forced the entire system to adjust in its wake. And in that quiet disruption lies its true power. Because it didn't ask for permission, it didn't seek approval, it simply happened. And now, the monarchy is left to navigate the consequences, not just of the decision itself, but of what it represents. A moment where control slipped, even briefly, and revealed how fragile that control might actually be. Yet beyond the immediate chaos, a deeper question lingered. What does this mean for the monarchy's future? Every royal decision carries weight, but some reshape history. As the implications of Edward's move continue to unfold, the monarchy stands at a crossroads. Is this the beginning of a quieter, more modern transition of power, or the start of a deeper division that could change everything? One thing is certain, the balance has shifted, and there's no going back. What began as a single, decisive act is now revealing itself as something far more enduring. By placing Lady Louise at the center of this transformation, Edward hasn't just changed the present, he has altered the trajectory of what comes next. Because empowering a younger generation in such a direct and unmistakable way doesn't simply update the monarchy, it challenges its very rhythm. It introduces a future that feels less predictable, less controlled by tradition, and more shaped by individual influence. And that, quietly but powerfully, changes everything. For generations, the monarchy has relied on a structure that moves slowly, deliberately, almost cautiously. Power is rarely transferred in bold gestures. It is inherited, absorbed, and carefully distributed over time. But this moment breaks from that pattern. It accelerates something that was expected to unfold gradually, and in doing so, it raises a question that cannot be ignored. If one royal can redefine the pace of change, who decides how far that change can go? Like perception too begins to shift in response. There is intrigue, certainly, curiosity, even admiration in some corners for what appears to be a decisive step toward renewal. But alongside that comes uncertainty. Because the monarchy's strength has always been rooted in its stability, in the sense that it evolves without ever seeming to lose control. This moment complicates that image. It introduces unpredictability into a system that has long depended on careful consistency. And then there is the tension that remains unresolved. Camilla's exclusion still lingers, not as a closed chapter, but as an open question. It has not been addressed, not fully explained, and in that silence, its significance only grows. Because what was left unsaid may carry more weight than what was announced. It suggests that beneath the surface, the dynamics within the monarchy are still shifting, still unsettled, still searching for a new balance that has yet to fully take shape. What makes this moment even more profound is the precedent it sets. Independence, once carefully managed, now feels slightly more accessible. The idea that a royal can act decisively, without full consensus, has been demonstrated, and once that line is crossed, it cannot easily be redrawn. Others will see it, consider it, perhaps even follow it. Not immediately, not openly, but the possibility now exists, and that alone is enough to reshape the internal landscape. And yet, for all the change, so much remains uncertain. What happens behind palace walls in the days, months, and years to come is still unfolding. Will this decision lead to a quieter evolution, where influence becomes more distributed, more flexible? Or will it deepen existing divisions, creating fractures that are harder to contain? The answer is not yet clear, but the tension is undeniable, because this is not just a story about one decision. It is about a shift in direction, a moment where the future of the monarchy feels less defined, more open, and perhaps more vulnerable than ever before. And as that future begins to take shape, one truth remains constant once change begins at this level. It rarely stops where it started, because in the monarchy, every ending is just the beginning of something far more unpredictable. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.